Today, we're talking about an Avigator. And I can already hear you asking, what the heck's an Avigator? Well, an Avigator is short for Aerial Navigator, as well as it's a new watch from Jack Mason, which is a 1930s style inspired watch that pays tribute to the fighting men on the ground as well as the sky. Or in other words, it's part Navitimer and part trench watch, which admittedly sounds like an odd combination, but it is a pretty good looking watch. But you can judge that for yourself. And before we get any further, I should also point out that this watch was provided by Jack Mason, and they're not asking for it back, hence the promotional tag. For this one, we're going to jump into the specs, and then I'll give you a little bit of background before getting to the nitty gritty. The Avigator here has a 42mm wide case with a lug-to-lug of 47.5. Total thickness is 12.3, and that's with both an aviation-inspired case back, as well as this very shallow domed sapphire crystal. Water resistance is 100 meters, its wired lugs are set 20mm apart, and it's all powered by a Seiko VK63 Meca-Quartz movement, which at this point I think everyone's familiar with, but if not, it's sort of a hybrid mechanical quartz movement. And before you finish the "it needs to be smaller" comment, there are a couple of things you should know. First off, aviation watches do tend to be a little larger, but more importantly, trench watch cases tend to wear smaller. The wired lugs are down and away from the case body, which holds the watch closer to your wrist, as well as it allows the strap to go straight down instead of having to come out and curve around your wrist. So this one, on my 7¼ inch wrist, probably wears more like a 41mm. Yep, I gotta admit, at the same time, with its wide expansive dial and onion-shaped crown and chronograph pushers, I'd say it has a much larger presence when you put it next to a similar sized diver. So in short, it wears like a 41, but looks a little bit more like a 43. And the last thing to know is that this is already a smaller, slimmed down Meca-Quartz version of one of Jack Mason's most popular watches, which might surprise a lot of you to hear, because a lot of people think they're a brand new microbrand, mostly because they've only recently started hearing about them. But Jack Mason's actually been around since 2015. Now, I don't want to go into a complete history, but for a while their watches were actually sold retail at Nordstrom's. But right before the pandemic, they decided to pull completely out of retail and sell directly online. And it's only been in this last year where they've started focusing in on creating watches more for enthusiasts, which is why you haven't really heard of them until recently. Now, the original Avigator was a much larger straight quartz watch. It was one of their best sellers, but it sat at 45mm. Although even with that, they did have a lot of people asking for a smaller version. So they decided to make this smaller, more streamlined version with a Meca-Quartz movement, which to me, and especially in this colorway, looks a bit more Navitimer than the original. Now, with that said, you can go ahead and finish your comment about the size, and I'll tell you what I'm thinking about the size. Even though it's pretty comfortable for its size, with this really large presence, I think they could have gone smaller. But I don't necessarily think they needed to. And what I think they're trying to do here is to create a watch that would appeal to their older customers as well as new enthusiasts. So they're trying to meet in the middle, and in that way 42mm is a good size. But at the same time, I can hear a lot of enthusiasts making an argument that they should have gone smaller to really focus in on them, especially if that's the market they're really trying to get into. Anyway, let's get to the nitty-gritty here. Like all watches out there, there are two parts to the design: the case and the dial. Yet here, that's also the clear division between the two inspirations behind the watch, as the case here is that of a World War I style trench watch, where it's a simple rounded design. In this case, a mostly polished one, which has a knurled clean bezel and thin wired lugs coming out of it. And I know that some are going to look at the lugs and think it just looks like they were stuck in there, which they were, and that's kind of the whole point of the design. As a lot of the early trench watches started out as pocket watches that the soldiers then fixed lugs to just so they could strap it on their wrist. So it is what it is, and it's a thing you either like or you don't. And I think the same could be said of the case back. Here it's secured with 4 small screws, and has all the particulars around the outer edge, while in the center you have an interesting turbine-inspired design. And I believe the case back is pretty similar to the one on the original Avigator. Now, the only real deviation from a typical trench watch is going to be with the chrono pushers at the right. Even the oversized crown fits in here, but I don't think I've ever seen a chronograph trench watch. That said, since this is a Seiko Meca-Quartz movement, pushers are nice and responsive, just like a mechanical chronograph. Simply because they sort of are. It's the whole point of the hybrid movement that is Meca-Quartz. Which leads us to the dial, which is more aviation inspired. And whether or not you want to call this watch an homage is really up to you. I mean, there was the original Avigator, but the thing is that watch was also probably inspired by the Navitimer. The Navitimer is so iconic, most aviation chronos are. Yet I think with that watch, you put them side by side, and they look different enough. And if you look at the original Avigator next to this new one, you can easily see where the design came from. It's a simpler, streamlined version of it. Yet, when you wind up doing that, it also looks a little bit more Navitimer than the original. So for me, it's sorta in between, but ultimately I don't think it really matters. Now, Jack Mason currently has 3 colorways of this one available. You have a silver panda, a darker navy blue, and this one, the sky blue. And I gotta say, I absolutely love this colorway. This light, metallic, pale blue. It looks just amazing with the black subdials and the white of the indices. And admittedly, this color is most likely borrowed from Breitling. I mean, it can't be a coincidence. But I don't care, it looks this good. This is a color that's just gorgeous and captivating when you notice it. Yet at the same time, it's still somewhat subtle. It's not really going to grab people's attention from across the room, not like a crimson red watch would. It's kind of an odd color that doesn't really seem to match anything, yet at the same time seems to go with everything. When I picked this one up, I actually got to see all 3 colorways, and this is the one I was immediately drawn to. The dial here is so striking, but there's more going on to it than the color. Another thing I like is the amount of depth the design has, with the sunken subdials, the applied indices rising up, and the raised tachymeter on the outer edge. It's a busy design, which to be fair most chronographs are, but all those layers create an interesting dial with a lot of depth. And all of these various components are sharp and well defined. And for those that like clean and concise designs, this one is going to be a bit chaotic for them. And that's not just with the Avigator, that's most chronographs out there, and I'd even say it about the Navitimer. The funny thing is that all that busyness and chaos also creates a few optical illusions, and in particular it makes the hands seem a little short. And you're probably thinking that as well at first glance, that they should be a little bit longer and maybe a little bit wider. But the thing is, they really aren't short for the proportions of the dial. The hour hand reaches the outer edge of the full indices at the top, the minute hand stretches into the chapter ring, and the chronograph hand rides the edge of the tachymeter, so they're right where they should be. It's just that with this type of dial, there's so much going on that it's hard to really judge the proportions. And when you're designing it, it's gotta be challenging because you do have to find some balance. You want it to be easy to read, but you also don't want to block the subdials. That said, I would also like to see the hand design changed up a little. I don't think you can really go longer or wider, but I'd love for them to maybe go a little bit higher. The macro shots show them to be a bit flat. I'd love it if they had some height and raised angles. Might help them stand out more. And the date is a little small, but overall I thought it was still usable. As a whole though, it's a good looking dial, a sharp looking watch, and I think one of the best looking Meca-Quartz chronographs I've seen. In some ways it's kinda strange how well the case and dial go together, considering they're from completely different eras. I've always loved the trench style case with wired lugs, so maybe I'm a little biased here, but I think the combination works, because when you're staring straight down at it, the case is rather subtle. There's nothing to distract or draw your attention away from this great dial. However, from the side where you no longer see the dial, that's where the case kind of comes into its own and gets a lot more interesting. As for the Lume's a bit of a mixed bag here. I mean, I love this design, and I love that the tachymeter track is lit up, even if it is for just a brief moment. And I do love that the subdials are loomed up. But when it really comes down to it, longevity could be better here. The dial fades out pretty quick, almost too quick. It's about the same levels as a Vostok. However, the hands do go a bit longer, but not quite as long as a Seiko Diver. So while Lume really isn't a priority when it comes to an aviation style watch, I'd still like it to be better here. So overall, I'd say it's just adequate. As for the strap, Each watch is going to come with this black genuine leather perforated one, and then you get a second strap if you're choosing, including a mesh one. The only one I've gotten to check out is this black perforated one, but it is a pretty good strap. The black contrasts the blue on the dial brilliantly, and the perforations give it a sporty look. It's also pretty comfortable once broken in, and the addition of quick release makes changing straps even easier. Now, with the last couple of Jack Mason reviews, price has been the most contentious subject, and I'm sure that's going to continue here. But right now, Jack Mason is selling the Avigator for $419, and it comes with one strap and you get a choice of a second. But value is really a logical argument, and you can't really talk about it without looking at what else is out there. And from what I've seen, a good Meca-Quartz chronograph these days is going to run between $300 to $500. And that's taking into account watches from Dan Henry, Vario, Hemmel, Stratton, and Brew. So a selection that's all over the microbrand spectrum. So while it may seem high, especially compared to where things were a few years ago, these days it seems to fall right in the middle of that range. So overall it's pretty reasonable considering how good the dial is. Now, there are a few things that I would like to change here, like bumping up the lume, or giving the hands some more depth. But overall I do like it. So bottom line, great watch. It winds up taking two completely different types of watches, both ones I really like, and puts them together. In some ways, you wouldn't think a trench watch and an aviation watch would work together, but I think it does. And the interesting thing is that both of those are very vintage retro style designs. Yet, due to the choice of colorways Jack Mason has gone with, the Avigator doesn't really come off as retro or vintage. Or at least it doesn't with this particular sky blue version, of which I absolutely love. And I think this is really the dial color to get. But what do you think about it? Should they have gone smaller, or is it a pretty good size? And if you can think of another chrono that does it better, mention that down below as well. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, like, comment, subscribe, click something down below. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time, and I'll see you next time.